Hi guys, my name's Caedrel, jungler for Excel, and this is my Sylas guide. So we'll start off with runes, create a new page. So for Sylas, most of the time you want to go for precision and go for Conqueror, but sometimes you can go for Electrocute, but we'll get to that later. So Conqueror is the most standard mastery you can go on Sylas. I think that most of the jungle matchups you pick Sylas into are sort of tankier matchups, and the fights do go on for a while, so Conqueror is really, really useful. And then the next useful thing I think is Triumph, most likely, for Sylas. You don't really get any value out of anything else. And then out of the legends, I think Tenacity is the best because you don't really get much lifesteal, and you don't really use lifesteal on Sylas, and attack speed is not that useful either. So even if they don't have that much CC, Tenacity is always a useful rune. I think it's really OP. And obviously the last one, I think Coup de Grace is the best. You could go for, I think like maybe Last Stand is good, but with your W you're going to heal up, so you will be above 40% HP, so this won't be that useful. And then for secondary, you kind of want to go for Magical Footwear. It's just such an efficient rune, like 300 gold's worth of boots just saved up like that. So I think Magical Footwear is definitely the best, and then Cosmic Insight is the second best because you don't really get any value out of anything else, and 5% CDR and everything is pretty useful. And then for the adaptive forces and stuff, you want to kind of go for attack speed so that you can clear your camps a bit faster early. Then you want to go for some adaptive force and some armor, which makes you a bit more tanky against the jungle camps. So this is a very standard rune page for Sylas. I think throughout most competitive games you'll see this kind of rune page because it's very safe, it helps you in extended fights, and it scales really well. But the second rune page you can go for if you are feeling quite confident that you're going to carry and the enemy team is a bit squishy. You can go for an Electrocute rune page. So in this one you kind of want to go for obviously Electrocute. Here you can take two different ones. You can go for Cheap Shot when you have red buff and you use E for example, and Q to slow them, or you can go for Taste of Blood. Both are pretty good. And then this one's more of a solo queue rune. You want to go for Eyeball Collection because you get more value out of it over the long run in solo queue because you get loads of kills in solo queue. But in competitive, obviously Zombie Ward's probably better, but I would stick with Eyeball Collection for now. And then you have two choices here. I think Relentless Hunter is really good, and so is Ravenous Hunter. It's just preference really, but I think the healing is quite nice. And then for secondary, it's the exact same. You can run with this exact same setup on the secondary, or you can go for something like this if the enemy team has a lot of CC. But yeah, that's it for Sylas. 2 rune pages, 1 for squishies, 1 for tanks. Okay, so for Sylas, his biggest sort of damage source is his Q and his passive. So maxing Q first is probably the most important thing you can do. So make sure you put points in Q early and go for 5 points in Q. It does a lot more damage, has a lower cooldown, and is your highest base damage spell. It's really important that you keep this one up. And then for second maxing, I think W is the second best to max. It gives you more healing and it gives you more damage on the percent HP that they're lower on. And the Q makes it so your camps are faster, and the W just makes it so your 1v1s are stronger. And then your E, you don't really need to put that many points in E. Obviously, when you get to level 18, you will have points in it, but just putting 1 point in the early game and just leaving it like that is fine. Putting points in E doesn't give that much value, doesn't give that much damage because most of your damage comes from your passive for your E anyway. So yeah, E last max, Q first, and W second. And the best spell to start with is probably Q, and you want to start on Raptors or something like this. However, if you do want to invade level 1, you kind of can start E, and then E is not that bad. You kind of have to start Raptors if you take E, or you have to start Red with a leash. But it's good for invading level 1 because you can E over the walls. But Q is the most standard one to take level 1. And then after Q, you kind of want to take E because it procs your passive twice on that spell. So Q and E, you definitely one-shot most of your camps with that. And then third point goes into W, and once you've got W, you've got all 3 spells, and 1v1ing is quite easy for Sylas. And then from then on, just put points in Q and W most of the time, and yeah, you'll scale really well. So on Sylas, as soon as you load into the game, you kind of want to start with the Hunter Talisman. It's the best one you can take with a refillable potion. After you've got around 700 gold, you kind of want to go for Red Smite most of the time. You can go Blue Smite if you do have Electrocute and the enemy team is quite squishy, but Red Smite is probably better most of the time. After Red Smite, you want to upgrade that into Runic Echoes, and once you've got your Runic Echoes, you're probably at your strongest. It's a big power spike for Sylas. After Runic Echoes, you kind of want to go for Proto Belt, Hextech Proto Belt, or you can go for Morello. Both are pretty good, but Proto Belt's just cheaper and more efficient. But if the enemy team does have a lot of healing, then Morello's really good. So after you've got your Runic Echoes and your Morello or Proto Belt, depending on the enemy team and how much gold you have, Zhonya's is probably the best buy most of the time, regardless of how much gold you have when you base. I think that Zhonya's is probably one of the most important items on Sylas because you're going in deep and you're quite squishy, so it's really useful. But you can also go for something like a Banshee's Veil if the enemy team has a lot of magic damage instead of Zhonya's. Both these items are quite tanky items and make it so in teamfights you can basically get on their backline and survive a lot longer. After these 3 items, you kind of want to look for Rabadons. It rounds out your item core a lot more, and basically tops off your AP to give you your biggest power spike. And after Rabadon's last item most of the time is Void Staff. It's basically the most important item on every mage. Gives you the solid magic pen. And along with, depending on which boots you went for, you can either go for Sork Shoes, which is probably the best item you can go for. But if the enemy team does have a lot of magic sort of CC or a lot of physical damage, you can go for Ninja Tabi or Merc Treads. But Sork Shoes are really, really important on Sylas, I think. So on Sylas, you kind of want to have your boots upgraded by around your second item. Your 2 core, where you have Runic Echoes and Morello, and then the Sork Shoes is probably one of your strongest points in the game. So upgrading your Sork Shoes while you have those 2 AP items is really important for the magic pen. But whenever you see you have like 800 gold to spare just to upgrade them, then you can probably do it anytime after 12 minutes because you are going to be running with the magical footwear, so you won't be looking for it early. Okay, on Sylas, you kind of want to start with obviously the Talisman. Most of the time you kind of want to start red buff. It's the most important camp to start on for Sylas because it increases your clear speed. So if you can get a leash on that side of the map, it's really, really important because solo starting on Sylas is not the greatest. Once you've done red buff with a Q start most of the time, you kind of want to go to Raptors with E second. You probably do a lot of damage to Raptors. You basically one-shot them. It's a really easy camp for Sylas. And saving Smite is quite useful because after Raptors, you kind of want to go to Krugs. So you're basically doing 3 camps on the same side of the map. And then after Krugs with Smite, you're probably going to be quite low HP. So you kind of want to base. And this is when Sylas sort of takes off in the early game. Once you base and you bought Machete, and you have both your jungle items, then you can walk into your blue side of the jungle and just full clear that. And then after you've done your full clear, you're basically ready to 1v1 anyone. You can go to any lane. I think that level 2 ganking on Sylas is not that strong unless you can see it's definitely a free kill. But most of the time you kind of want to just clear both sides of your jungle, contest the Scuttle Crab and just get to level 5. So on Sylas, once you get your ult, it also depends on the enemy team kind of, because if they have useful ults, so for example if the enemy team has like a Varus or an Ashe, something like a Rumble, like this kind of long range ult which can set up a gank, then you kind of want to look for those ults. Some ults aren't that useful on Sylas. Some of the mid laners ults aren't that useful, so ults like Aatrox ult, Syndra ult, Orianna ult, they don't really set up Sylas enough to actually get an engage off. So you kind of want to look for these long range kind of AP-ish ults where you can just fire it at the enemy champion and just sort of engage onto them. So once you've hit 6 on Sylas and you've done 2 full clears basically, let's say you haven't really got any kills yet and you have got your ult, I think the best thing to do is once you've gone to base and you're running out of base, look at the enemy team comp and try to determine which ultimate's probably the most effective for you. And you can either steal that ult and use it on them to gank that lane, or you could surprise them by taking like an Ashe ult and then going to mid lane and then firing it out of the bush. Things like that, just trying to be creative. I think that's the most important thing with Sylas in the mid game. Trying to be creative and coming up with these weird ways to get kills and just pulling out ults from top and then using them bot and stuff like this. It can really catch the enemy team off guard. Like for example, taking a Shen ult and then the enemy team commits on your bot lane and you can just Shen ult down. Things like this really catch the enemy team off guard. So I think creativity with Sylas is really important with the mid game, and just taking a few more seconds than normal to just think about how you're going to set up the play and where you're going to set up the play. So for Sylas, your strongest point is basically after you've got Runic Echoes. You can look to contest the enemy jungler early on if you have got your red smite and you are feeling confident. If you have like a level advantage or you have the HP advantage, you can always contest the enemy jungler. And I think you shouldn't be too afraid of doing neutral objectives on Sylas. Doing Drake is not super hard if you have like your bot lane helping you or your mid lane. I think you could just treat it like any other jungler where soloing them is not the greatest. So for example, like Lee Sin can solo Dragon, but Sylas can't. You need help for sure. So you kind of want to play around your lanes as Sylas. You want to make sure that they can get the push, they can get the prio, and then you can use that to get neutral objectives, because Sylas, when it comes to neutral objectives, is not the greatest to solo them. But you shouldn't be too afraid early game. I think early to mid game, you can definitely look to skirmish a lot. I think Sylas is a champion which loves skirmishing. All of his abilities are all about fighting and just trying to force things wherever he can. So playing around neutrals is really important and just making sure you can get fights on your terms. So when it comes to Sylas in the mid-late game, team fights can be a bit tricky depending on the enemy team. So if they have a lot of hard CC and you don't have a lot of tenacity, going in you can get one shot, so you have to be really careful of how you play the team fights. I think that if you can get a really good ultimate from them, so for example like an Akali ult or a Rumble ult, you can set up the team fights yourself, but the skill cap of Sylas all depends on the enemy champion. So if you're against champions with really complicated ultimates, which are quite hard to be creative with in team fights, then the champ itself gets naturally harder, right? So Unless you're against like a Malphite, for example, you just take that ult and then you can just ult their backline. But most of the time it's quite hard to get on the backline as Sylas unless you have some sort of flank. Most of the time you kind of want to just play around your cooldowns, just Q them from long range, and if you do see an opening you can E in and then use your W to get out, and you also have Zhonya's as well, so you shouldn't be too afraid to dive a bit deep, but going on their AD carry alone and stuff like this is really hard, especially as Sylas, because your abilities are skill shots essentially, so if your abilities are dodged, you can get kited really easily, so you have to play around your cooldowns and play around your team basically, and look for champions that are already CC'd, and just look for champions that you can one-shot and skirmish on the side. So in the mid-late game, playing around Nash is quite useful as Sylas because there's a lot of chokes and there's a lot of jungle around the Nash, so hiding in bush is Sylas, hiding in pings, looking for picks is really important on Sylas. Like, if you can catch out the enemy AD carry and land your skill shots and then one-shot them, this could always lead to a Nash, so you shouldn't be too afraid to be a sort of assassin as Sylas. You can play it in two different ways, where if the ultimates you can steal aren't that useful, then you can look for flanks and you can look to set up from coming from the side, or you can look for picks in bushes. But if you do have these big teamfight ultimates like Rumble, Malphite, things like this, huge AoE ultimates which can basically win you a teamfight, then you kind of want to pull them into the Baron, make them come to you, and then turn the teamfight with all of these ultimates. So once you get the Nash, it's most likely your ult's on cooldown from the really good ults, so if you don't have actually like a really good teamfight ult, then you can just sit on the sidelines and let your AD carry and mid lane and carries like step up and hit the towers and basically win you the game. And if the enemy team does engage on you, that's where Sylas is really strong, because Sylas is really good at turning fights and he's also good at skirmishing the front line, because the front line never really has enough damage to kill Sylas and he has lots of healing. So if you can manage where you're positioned as Sylas in team fights and make sure they're coming into you and you can always turn the fight on your terms, then most of the time you'll come out ahead. But yeah, you should definitely look for these huge teamfight ultimates, and once you're sieging with Nash, just be around your team basically. Like, don't be looking for these E's across the map and trying to make these wow plays. Just chill with your team. If they engage on you, then you're going to win. So Sylas only has a few bad matchups. I think that the early skirmishing champions like Olaf, Xin Zhao really shut down Sylas in the 1v1, but it isn't unplayable. You can just farm your camps and look to fight him later on when you've got your jungle item. But there are champions like Kha'Zix which do make it a bit hard, because they just sit there power farming, and if you can't punish it early, which is pretty hard as Sylas, then the 1v1 does get a bit hard against Kha'Zix. But against most other jungle champions like Gragas, Sejuani, Lee Sin, Jarvan, Nocturne, Sylas is actually really good into them. So blind picking Sylas isn't that bad. You can't really get punished that much in solo queue or in competitive. It's just the 1v1s itself is quite hard, and yeah, just look out for Olaf, Xin Zhao and Kha'Zix, and they are quite hard matchups, but they're not unwinnable. So I think Sylas is quite a complicated champ, and like I said a few times, it's a very creative champ. You have to come up with ways to get fed on Sylas. Your early game is pretty strong, and the champ itself is very, very good at fighting, very good at skirmishing, and it scales really well. So on Sylas, you basically just want to look for the most creative ways you can get the ultimates, and just try to catch the enemy off guard with these ultimates. So yeah, taking the top lane ult and going bolt and ulting them with it, and just setting up dives on Sylas is really important as well with stopwatch. And just looking to 1v1 the enemy jungler if you do have an elite, because once you are ahead on Sylas against the enemy jungler, you shouldn't be afraid at all to 1v1 him anywhere, because 9 times out of 10 you'll probably win. So that was my Sylas guide, guys. Thanks for watching. If you did enjoy the video, make sure to like, subscribe and drop a comment. But I have done an advanced guide on Sylas, which is a lot more in depth, so if you check the description below, there will be a link to that.